The heavy front doors of the concert hall closed with a soft final thud, sealing away the noise of the city and the chatter of the last departing patrons. Inside, a special kind of quiet began to settle, a deep silence that felt different from the quiet of an empty street. It was a silence full of echoes, not just of sound but of emotion. For the young boy, this was the time the building truly came alive. His father, a man whose hands seemed to be made of both gentle care and tough, unyielding work, was the head janitor. While the world saw the grand concerts and the famous performers, the boy saw the other side, the soul of the hall that revealed itself only after the crowds had gone home. He was a shadow in his father's world, a small, quiet presence that learned to move without making a sound. While his father went about his duties, the boy would wander. He wasn't in the way. He was simply part of the landscape, like the old velvet curtains or the polished brass railings. His father would push his large cleaning cart down the aisles, the squeak of its wheels the only sound breaking the peace. The boy would follow, his footsteps light on the thick carpet, his eyes taking in everything. He watched his father work with a kind of focused reverence. The way he carefully wiped down every seat, making sure not a single speck of dust remained. The way he polished the wooden handrails until they gleamed like dark honey under the dim emergency lights. It was more than a job to his father. It was a guardianship. He was taking care of a special place. And the boy understood that without ever being told, sometimes his father would hand him a soft cloth and point to a low table or a row of armrests. "A little help, champ?" he'd say with a tired but warm smile. The boy would take the cloth and work with the same care, his small hands mimicking his father's practiced movements. These were moments of quiet connection between them, a shared language spoken not in words, but in the simple act of caring for this magnificent space. But the boy's mind was always somewhere else. His hands might be cleaning a baseboard, but his ears were listening for something else. He was listening for the ghosts of the music. He believed the hall remembered every note ever played within its walls. On some nights, if he stood perfectly still in the middle of the main floor, he could almost hear them, a faint violin soaring, a deep cello humming, the thunder of 100 instruments crashing together in a grand finale. It was his secret symphony, a silent concert played just for him. The music wasn't just in his head. It seemed to live in the very air he breathed, in the dust motes that danced in the slivers of light from the stage lamps. He would close his eyes and let it wash over him, a wave of sound and feeling that no one else could hear. His explorations always led him to the same place, the stage. To him, the stage was not just wood and plaster. It was a different world, a magical land floating above the ordinary. He would climb the side steps cautiously, his heart beating a little faster with each step. Standing in the center, he would look out at the vast, empty auditorium. The thousands of red velvet seats stared back at him like a silent, patient audience, waiting for a show that never came. He felt small and huge at the same time, a lone performer in the world's grandest, most private theater. And then, there it was. The reason for it all. Sitting in the middle of the stage, under a single, soft spotlight, was the grand piano. It was a monster of gleaming black wood, a sleeping giant with 88 white teeth. It was the most beautiful and forbidden thing he had ever seen. His father had told him more than once not to touch it. "It's a very expensive and important instrument," he had explained gently. "It's not for playing with." The boy understood. He didn't want to play with it. He wanted to talk to it. He would often sit on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side, and just look at it. He imagined the famous pianists who had sat on that bench, their fingers flying across the keys. During rehearsals, when he was supposed to be waiting quietly backstage, he would find a hiding spot in the wings, peeking through a small gap in the heavy curtains. He would watch the guest pianist, a person he saw as a magician. He saw the way their hands moved, a blur of motion that somehow created the most incredible sounds he had ever heard. He didn't understand the notes on the page or the theory the musician talked about with the conductor. All he understood was the feeling. While the pianist played, the boy would be sitting on the floor, his own fingers twitching on his legs. He would press his imaginary keys, trying to copy the movements, trying to feel the music in his own body. He could feel the fast, happy parts as a fluttering in his chest and the slow, sad parts as a deep ache in his stomach. He wasn't just hearing the music, he was experiencing it. It was a language he was born knowing, even if he couldn't speak it yet. The longing to actually touch the real keys, to feel the cool ivory under his fingertips and to hear a sound that he himself created was a constant, quiet ache inside him. It was a pull so strong that it felt like the piano was calling to him, whispering its secrets in the silent symphony only he could hear. Every night he would leave the hall with that feeling, a promise to the sleeping black beast that one day he would be brave enough to sit at its keys and answer its call. The world outside the grand concert hall had turned into a swirling wall of white. A blizzard, the kind that only happened once every few years, had descended upon the city with a sudden angry fury. The wind howled a lonely song against the tall windows, and snow piled up against the doors like a soft, white wall, trapping everyone inside. The orchestra, which had been scheduled for a late afternoon rehearsal, had been sent home hours ago, their musicians disappearing into the storm one by one. For the boy, however, the storm was a gift. It transformed the already quiet hall into a kingdom of silence, a world that belonged only to him. His father had been called down to the deep, dark basement. A pipe had burst, and the old building was groaning under the pressure of the freezing cold. "Stay up here, champ," his father had said, pulling on his heavy coat and boots. "Read a book or just wait, I'll be back as soon as I can. And remember, don't touch anything you're not supposed to." The boy had nodded, watching his father disappear down the service stairs, the sound of his heavy footsteps fading until only the sound of the wind remained. He was alone. Truly, completely alone. The feeling was a mix of excitement and a strange, hollow loneliness. He walked through the main lobby, his footsteps the only sound on the marble floor. The usual shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker. He felt like the king of a silent, sleeping castle. He wandered through the empty hallways, running his hand along the velvet wallpaper, feeling the texture under his fingertips. But every path, every thought led him back to the same place, the auditorium. And the stage. He stood at the entrance to the main hall, looking out at the sea of empty red seats. A single ghost light stood on a pole in the middle of the stage, casting a long, lonely shadow and creating a soft, golden glow around the piano. It looked like a holy object in a quiet temple. The wind outside seemed to push him from behind, a gentle but firm nudge. He thought of his father's warning. He thought of the do not touch rule that was as much a part of this hall as the velvet seats themselves. But the music inside him was louder than his father's voice. The silent symphony in his head was begging to be set free. He took a step, then another. His walk down the center aisle was the longest walk of his life. Each step felt heavy, meaningful. He was not just a boy walking to a stage. He was a pilgrim on a final journey. He climbed the side steps, his heart thumping a rhythm against his ribs that was faster and more nervous than any orchestra's drumbeat. He stood on the stage, the wood cool beneath his thin shoes. The piano was right there in front of him, so close he could smell the faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. He sat on the bench. It was firm and cold. He felt very small in front of the enormous instrument. For a long time he just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, looking at the keys. They were a world of their own, a landscape of black and white promises. He imagined the famous pianist, his hands moving like magic. He could hear the music in his head, the piece the orchestra had been rehearsing. It was a complicated, powerful piece, full of big, crashing sounds and then soft, whispering notes that made you want to cry. Slowly, as if moving through water, he lifted his right hand. He held it over the keys, his fingers trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, and then he let one finger fall. A single, clear note rang out. C. It was a perfect, beautiful sound that hung in the silent air like a star. The boy's eyes went wide. He had made that. That sound had come from him. A smile, small and hesitant, spread across his face. He pressed another key, and another. He wasn't trying to play the song yet. He was just saying hello? He was introducing himself to the piano, and the piano was introducing itself to him. Each note was a word in their first conversation, then he closed his eyes. He let his memory take over. He remembered the way the pianist's hands had moved, the way the music had made him feel. He placed both hands on the keys, and this time he began to play. It wasn't perfect. His fingers were small and not yet strong enough for some of the big chords. He missed a few notes, and the rhythm was a little unsteady, like a child learning to walk. But it didn't matter. What came out of the piano was not just a collection of notes. It was a story. It was all the feelings he had ever kept locked inside himself. It was the loneliness of wandering the empty hall, the awe of watching the orchestra, the deep, unspoken longing he felt every time he saw the piano. He played with a raw, honest emotion that no trained musician could ever copy. He wasn't thinking about the notes. He was feeling the music, and his fingers were just following his heart high up in his office. A room cluttered with scores and papers. The maestro was rubbing his tired eyes. He hated paperwork. It was the boring, necessary evil that came with the glory of creating music. He was about to call it a night when a sound drifted up to him. It was faint, but it was definitely the piano. He frowned. He had sent everyone home. Who would be brazen enough to play the concert grand without permission? He assumed it was one of the musicians, perhaps the guest pianist, who had decided to stay and practice despite the storm. Annoyed at the rule breaking, he got up from his desk and walked out into the hallway to tell them to go home. But as he got closer to the auditorium, he stopped. The music was different. It was flawed, yes, but there was something else. A passion. A purity. It was like listening to a bird singing in the wild, not a bird trained to perform in a cage. He moved silently down the carpeted hallway, his anger melting away, replaced by a deep, growing curiosity. He reached the heavy velvet curtain that led to the wings of the stage and peered through a small gap, and there he saw him. A small boy, wearing a worn jacket, his eyes closed in concentration, his whole body swaying with the music. The maestro, a man who had heard the greatest pianists in the world play in the greatest halls, stood frozen. He forgot about the storm, forgot about the paperwork, forgot about everything. He just listened. He was witnessing something that happened only once in a lifetime. If that often, the discovery of a raw, breathtaking, natural talent. The boy wasn't just playing the piano. He was pouring his soul out into the silent, empty hall. A few musicians who had been trapped by the storm and were huddled in a nearby room also fell silent, seeing their famously stern conductor standing motionless, a look of complete and utter shock on his face. They all listened, captivated, as the janitor's son filled the concert hall with a music that was more real than any they had ever heard before. The last note of the boy's impromptu performance faded into the silent hall, leaving behind a ghost of sound that seemed to hang in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. For a moment, the boy just sat there, his eyes still closed, lost in the world he had created. Then a floorboard creaked in the wings. His eyes flew open and his heart jumped into his throat. He spun around on the bench, expecting to see his father, his face a mask of anger and disappointment. But it wasn't his father. It was the maestro. The boy's blood ran cold. He had seen the maestro from a distance, a formidable figure with a stern face and a reputation for being as terrifying as a thunderstorm. He was the man who could make professional musicians cry with a single sharp word. The boy shrunk, expecting to be yelled at, to be grabbed by the arm and thrown out of the hall forever. He braced himself for the storm, but the storm didn't come. The maestro didn't look angry. He looked different. His usual hard expression was gone, replaced by something the boy couldn't quite read. It was a mix of shock, curiosity, and something else, something that looked a lot like wonder. He walked slowly onto the stage, his footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. He stopped a few feet away from the piano and looked at the boy, not with anger, but with a deep, searching gaze. "Who are you?" The maestro asked, his voice quieter than the boy had ever heard it. I'm the janitor's son," the boy stammered. His voice barely a whisper. The maestro nodded slowly, as if this was the most normal answer in the world. He looked at the boy's small, trembling hands resting on the keys. "Who taught you to play like that?" "No one," the boy said honestly. "I just listen." The maestro was silent for a long time. He walked over to the piano and ran a hand over its smooth, glossy surface. "You have a gift," he said, still not looking at the boy. "A raw, wild, beautiful gift. But a gift like this is like a wild animal. If you don't train it, it will destroy itself. It will run wild and become nothing but noise." He finally turned to face the boy, his eyes intense. "I will teach you. I will give you lessons for free, but you must promise me something. You must give me everything. Your time, your energy, your focus. No excuses. No complaining. Absolute dedication. Can you do that?" The boy's mind was spinning. Lessons from the maestro? It was like a fish being asked to fly. It was impossible, a dream so big it couldn't be real. He looked at the maestro's serious face and saw that he was not joking. This was a real offer. A door was opening in front of him, a door he never even knew existed. He thought of the silent symphonies in his head, the longing in his heart every time he saw the piano. This was his chance. He took a deep breath and nodded, his fear being replaced by a surge of determination. "Yes," he said, his voice a little stronger this time. "I can." What followed was not the beautiful dream the boy had imagined. It was a nightmare. The maestro was a merciless teacher. The first thing he did was take away the boy's music. "Forget the songs," he said, placing a thick book of scales on the piano. "This is your music now? For the next 6 months, you will play nothing but this. Up and down, up and down. Every day." The joy the boy had felt was crushed under the weight of endless, boring practice. The music, which had once been a free and soaring bird, was now locked in a tiny, repetitive cage. The metronome on the piano ticked like a cold, heartless clock, counting out the seconds of his life. His fingers, which once danced across the keys, now felt stiff and clumsy. The maestro was always there, pointing out every mistake. "Your thumb is weak. Your timing is off." Again, from the top. The boy began to hate the piano. He started to dread the lessons. He would come home late at night, his fingers aching, his head throbbing, and slump into a chair at the small table in their small apartment. His father would watch him, his face etched with worry. "This world. It's not for people like us, son," his father said one evening, as the boy massaged his sore hands. "It's a cruel place. It builds you up just to break you down. I'm afraid it's going to break your spirit." He saw the light that used to be in his son's eyes dimming with each passing day. He saw the boy he knew, the one who found magic in empty hallways, disappearing. The conflict at home was painful. The boy would snap at his father, "You don't understand. This is what I wanted." But a part of him knew his father was right. The magic was gone. Things were no better at the conservatory where the maestro taught. The other students were all from wealthy families. They wore nice clothes and talked about their expensive instruments and their summers in music camp. They looked at the boy in his worn jacket and scuffed shoes with a mixture of pity and contempt. He heard their whispers in the hallways. "Look, it's the janitor's kid." Heard the maestros taking him on as a charity case. He had no friends there. He was an outsider, a stray dog that had been allowed into a fancy party. The loneliness was a heavy cloak he wore every day. The breaking point came during a lesson 3 months in. The boy was struggling with a particularly difficult exercise, his fingers fumbling and his mind blank with frustration. The maestro stood over him, his face like a block of stone. "No, no, no." The maestro finally shouted, his voice echoing in the small practice room. "You are playing like a street urchin banging on a trash can. There is no music, only noise. You have forgotten the very thing that made me stop and listen that night in the hall. Your soul, you have lost your soul." The words hit the boy like a physical blow. The one thing he thought was special about him, the one thing the maestro himself had recognized, was gone. He had failed. He had broken the wild animal just as his father feared. Tears of shame and anger welled up in his eyes. Without a word, he pushed the bench back, stood up, and ran out of the room. He didn't stop running until he was out of the building and halfway home. He burst into the apartment, his face streaked with tears. "I'm done," he yelled at his father, who was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. "I quit. I hate it. I never want to see a piano again." His father turned off the stove, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked over to his son. He looked at the boy's tear-streaked face, at the raw pain in his eyes. He saw not a failed musician, but his broken-hearted son. All his fears about the cruel world of high art, about impossible dreams, vanished. All that mattered was his son's spirit. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "It's for the best." He just placed his rough, work-worn hand gently on his son's shoulder. He looked him in the eye and said, in a quiet, firm voice, "Don't let them take the music from you. Not even him." In that moment, the boy understood. His father wasn't giving him permission to become a famous pianist. He was giving him permission to hold on to the part of himself that was real, the part that loved the music more than anything. It was the most important lesson he would ever learn. The days that followed his tearful promise to his father were different. The boy went back to his lessons, but something had changed between him and the maestro. The stern, unyielding taskmaster was still there, but now a different side of him would sometimes show up. One afternoon, instead of making the boy play scales, the maestro sat at the piano himself. He played a simple, haunting melody. It wasn't complicated or flashy, but it was filled with a deep sadness that made the boy's heart ache. "Technique is the box," the maestro said softly, his fingers still on the keys. "But the music, the real music, is what you put inside the box. Don't ever let the box become more important than what's inside." From that day on, the lessons changed. They were still hard, still demanding, but now the maestro would often stop him and say, "No, feel it. What does that chord mean to you? Tell me a story with it." The boy began to understand. He wasn't just learning to press keys. He was learning to translate his feelings into sound. The months passed like this, a blur of practice, discovery, and slow, steady growth. His hands, once small and weak, became stronger. His fingers, which used to fumble, now moved with a new confidence. He was no longer just a boy with a feeling. He was becoming a musician. Then the night came. It was the biggest night of the year for the concert hall, a special gala with the most important people in the city in the audience. The program featured a famous piano concerto, and the hall had brought in a world-renowned pianist to perform it. Backstage, the air was buzzing with a nervous energy. The boy was there too, but not as a performer. He was helping his father, handing him tools and holding a flashlight while his father fixed a wobbly leg on a prop table. He was just part of the background, the janitor's son, watching the fancy world of classical music prepare to shine. And then chaos erupted. A shout came from the stage door. A stagehand came running in, his face pale. "It's the pianist. He fell." He slipped on the ice outside the stage door. Panic swept through the backstage area. The hall manager came running, followed by the maestro. They found the guest pianist on the ground, his hand twisted at an unnatural angle. He was in great pain, and it was clear he would not be playing tonight. The manager was wringing his hands, his face a mask of despair. "The concert is ruined. We can't get a replacement on such short notice." The audience is already seated. A heavy silence fell over the panicked group. Everyone looked at the maestro, waiting for him to explode, to call off the concert and face the angry crowd. But the maestro's face was strangely calm. He looked at the injured pianist being helped away, then his eyes scanned the chaotic backstage area. They passed over the frantic stagehands, the worried manager, and then they stopped. They stopped on the boy, who was standing frozen in the corner, holding a flashlight. The maestro's eyes locked with his. In that moment, the boy felt a jolt of fear, like he had been caught doing something wrong. "He will play," the maestro said, his voice cutting through the panic. He pointed directly at the boy. The manager stared at the maestro as if he had gone insane. "He? Who is he?" "He's just a child, a boy." "He is my student," the maestro said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And he knows the piece. Go and tell the audience there will be a slight change in the program." He turned to the boy. "Go, get changed. Put on one of the spare concert jackets. You have 10 minutes. The boy felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. His blood turned to ice. Me? Play? In front of all those people? He wanted to scream, "No, I can't," but his feet felt glued to the floor. His father rushed to his side, his face full of terror. "Sir, you can't be serious," he pleaded with the maestro. "He's just a boy. He'll be humiliated." The maestro looked at the father, his expression softening for just a second. "Trust me," he said. Then he looked back at the boy. "You can do this. You have been preparing for this your whole life." Somehow, the boy found himself being led to a small dressing room. Someone handed him a stiff, black concert jacket that was too big for him. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely button it. He looked in the mirror and saw a scared little kid playing dress-up in a man's clothes. He could hear the murmur of the crowd out in the hall, a low, rumbling sound like a distant sea. A wave of nausea washed over him. He was going to be sick. He was going to walk out there and forget everything. His mind would go blank and he would just sit there in silence. While thousands of people stared at him, he walked out of the dressing room and toward the side of the stage. The orchestra musicians were already in their seats, tuning their instruments and whispering to each other. He could feel their eyes on him, looks of pity, skepticism, and even anger. They didn't want their big night ruined by some kid. He peered through a small gap in the heavy curtain and looked out at the sea of people. They were all dressed up, sparkling with jewelry and expectation. And then, high up in the very last row, in the cheapest seat in the house, he saw him. His father. He had managed to get a ticket somehow. He wasn't in his work clothes. He was wearing a clean shirt and his hair was combed. He was leaning forward, his hands gripping the railing, his face a mixture of absolute terror and a fierce, unbreakable pride. Seeing his father gave the boy a small anchor in the storm of his fear. Just then, the maestro was beside him. "They are out there waiting," he said quietly. "They are expecting a famous man. They will be disappointed, maybe even angry at first. Do not play for them. Do not play to prove them wrong. Do not even play for me." The maestro put a hand on his shoulder. "Forget the scales. Forget the technique. Forget everything I have made you practice for months. Just close your eyes and play for me the music I heard that first night in the empty hall. Play what is in your heart. Can you do that for me?" The boy looked at the maestro and saw not the fearsome teacher, but the man who had heard his soul that night. He thought of his father's face in the crowd. He thought of the silent symphonies in his head. He took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. The announcer's voice boomed through the hall, explaining the last-minute change. A ripple of confused murmurs went through the audience. The maestro walked onto the stage to a smattering of polite applause. He turned to the orchestra and raised his baton. Then he looked toward the wings and gave the boy a single, sharp nod. It was time. The boy walked out onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him. He couldn't see the faces anymore, just a vast, dark sea of people. He sat at the familiar piano, the bench feeling suddenly very strange and public. He placed his shaking fingers on the keys. The hall was silent. He closed his eyes. He thought of his father, of the maestro's words, of the music that lived inside him. And then he began to play. The first note that came from the piano was not loud or showy. It was small and clear, like a single drop of rain falling on a still pond. The boy's fingers, which had been shaking so badly just moments before, suddenly felt calm. The maestro's words were in his mind, a steady anchor in the sea of faces he couldn't see. Play what is in your heart. So he did. He closed his eyes and let the music that lived inside him take over. He wasn't thinking about the difficult notes or the fast passages. He was just telling a story. The story began softly, a quiet, lonely melody that spoke of wandering through empty hallways and watching the world from the sidelines. It was the sound of his own feelings, the ones he could never put into words. The audience, which had been full of confused murmurs, fell silent. They leaned forward in their velvet seats, their curiosity piqued. Who was this child? And where was this music coming from? The orchestra musicians, who had been ready to just go through the motions, found themselves listening. Their instruments rested in their laps. The first violinist, a woman who had played for 30 years, slowly lowered her bow, her eyes fixed on the small figure at the piano. The maestro stood on his podium, his baton held loosely in his hand. He wasn't conducting in the normal way. He was guiding, nudging the orchestra to follow the boy, to support him, to become a part of his story. He was no longer the master of the ship. He was letting a new, unexpected captain steer them through uncharted waters. The music began to grow. It became more complex, more confident. The fast parts were not just a flurry of notes. They were like a happy, chasing game full of life and laughter. The boy's body started to move with the rhythm, swaying gently from side to side. He was no longer the scared kid in the too big jacket. He was one with the piano, one with the music. High up in the last row, his father watched with tears streaming down his face. He wasn't just hearing a piano concerto. He was hearing his son's life. He heard the loneliness, the wonder, the frustration, and the joy. He saw the little boy who used to hide in the wings, and he saw the young man who was now bearing his soul to thousands of people. The pride that swelled in his chest was so powerful it almost hurt. He remembered his own forgotten dreams, the ones he had buried under years of hard work and practicality. He had wanted to play the guitar once, to sing songs for people, but life had gotten in the way. Seeing his son up there, living a dream he never thought possible, felt like a part of his own heart was healing. The music soared, reaching a powerful, emotional peak. The entire orchestra was playing now, but they were following the boy's lead. He was the sun, and they were the planets revolving around him. The sound filled every corner of the grand hall, a wave of pure, raw emotion that washed over everyone. It was a sound that was technically brilliant, but more than that, it was honest. It was real. In a world of polished, perfect performances, this was something rare and precious. It was music that came from the heart, not just from the fingers. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm of music passed. The boy brought it back down to the soft, simple melody from the beginning. It was like coming home after a long, difficult journey. He played the final notes, each one a gentle, perfect drop of sound. The last chord hung in the air, shimmering and beautiful, before slowly fading into absolute silence. The silence that followed was the most powerful sound of the night. No one moved. No one coughed or rustled their program. The entire hall, thousands of people, held a collective breath. It was a sacred moment, a shared understanding that they had all just witnessed something extraordinary. The boy sat at the piano, his chest heaving, his hands still resting on the keys. He slowly opened his eyes and blinked as if waking from a dream. He saw the dark, empty space in front of him, and for a second he was scared again. Had he done badly? Then it started. A single person in the front row began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the silence was broken by a roar of applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thunderous, deafening wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People jumped to their feet, their faces filled with awe and emotion. The boy watched as a sea of standing figures filled the hall, all of them clapping for him. He saw the orchestra musicians on their feet, their bows and instruments forgotten, clapping and cheering for him. He looked to the side of the stage and saw the maestro, a rare, genuine smile on his face, giving him a single, slow nod of profound respect backstage after the curtain had fallen. The boy was surrounded by people patting him on the back and congratulating him, but he only had eyes for one person. His father pushed through the small crowd and wrapped his son in a hug, so tight it almost took his breath away. He didn't say anything at first, he just held him, the rough fabric of his work jacket scratching against the boy's cheek. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were still wet with tears. "I had a dream once too," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to be a musician. I played a little guitar. I was going to travel the world." He looked down at his calloused, work-worn hands. "But then my father got sick, and I had to get a job. And then I met your mother, and you came along. And the dream just got smaller and smaller until it was gone." I spent all these years cleaning this hall, thinking I was just taking care of a building, but I was wrong. I was keeping it safe for you." He looked his son in the eye, his pride shining brighter than any stage light. "You didn't just play the piano tonight, son. You played my dream too." "Thank you." Weeks later, the boy was no longer just the janitor's son. He was the boy who played the piano. He still helped his father after hours, but now he would also sit on the stage and practice the music filling the empty hall. One evening as he was leaving, he saw the new janitor, a man who had replaced his father when he was promoted to a management position. The new janitor had a young son with him, about the same age the boy was when he first started exploring the hall. The boy watched as the young son looked at the grand piano on the stage with the same wide-eyed wonder he once had. The boy walked over to them and gave the young boy a small, knowing smile. It was a silent promise, a passing of the torch. The music was for everyone, and the magic of this place was waiting for anyone who was brave enough to listen to the song in their own heart.